So, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Irish American Heritage Museum. We're delighted to have with us two folklorists and historians from Kerry, Jane and Maurice O'Keefe, who run a fantastic project called Irish Life and Lore. Tonight, we're going to talk about their latest book, The Big Houses of Kerry, which trace the often turbulent, but quite long relationship that landlords and tenants had in Ireland. These estates, as you probably know, anyone who's visited Ireland, some of them are in rubble now. Many of them are still very beautiful. And so, for 500 years, these landlords and tenants had a sometimes complicated history, particularly during the Great Hunger and then afterwards during Ireland's struggle for independence from 1916 through the Civil War. So I'm going to turn it over now to Jane, and she's going to talk to us about the book. And then later on, Maurice will fill us in on their wider projects, where, as I say, they collect stories and folklore from mostly from Kerry, which of course, as you all know, is my own home county. So we're delighted to have them. Welcome, Jane and Maurice, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It's a lovely introduction. Thank you. So the book, The Big House in Kerry, we published it ourselves in November last, and it was launched in Mucker's House in Killarney on the 1st of December. And the venue was very appropriate because, as people possibly know, or anybody from Kerry certainly knows, Mucker's House itself was one of the major big houses in Kerry, and today is part of Ireland's heritage, which belongs to the government and which is open to the public, and it's enclosed by a magical park and encompassing, of course, the lakes of Killarney, very close by as well. So that was the beginning. We had the launch there, and the book hit the bookshops in late November, and it has been received very well indeed, which is a relief as much as anything else, because it took about 3 years of work, research, and the editing process obviously had to be very carefully done and took quite a long time. 12 historians, including myself, contributed chapters on various houses in Kerry. And I'll go through the list now in a moment, but also just to go back to the actual physical book, the design was done by our daughter Elaine O'Keefe, who is part of the School of History in UCC, and her husband Barra, also, who's a photographer, took some of the wonderful aerial drone images of some of the houses for us. So it's a family affair, and we were very fortunate that was the case. So just to go through briefly the list of historians and the houses that they write about. So the first chapter was written by Dr. John Knightley, who comes from Milltown, and it's a very important chapter, and we've had a lot of positive feedback on it, because it's called The Burning of Kerry's Big Houses, 1919 to 1923, and it provides a very clear contextual image of life as it was in Ireland from 1916 to 1923, and more importantly 1919 to 1923. But for somebody who isn't familiar with Ireland's history and the landlord-tenant system, it will bring a person into the place and the time and the houses and the feelings of people in those turbulent years. And it's a really important chapter. So the first chapter following that is Tarbert House in North Kerry. And this chapter was written by Dr. Declan Downey, who is a native of Tarbert and works as a historian in UCD. And Tarbert House was owned by the Leslie family. And importantly, this house is one of the very few in Kerry, or in Ireland, in fact, which is still owned by the original family. So the next chapter we come to is about Kilmorna House, Listowel, which is close.
We've just had a little freezing action again. Hang on one tick. We might come back. I don't think it's at my end. Oh, where
You okay?
oh, you're back.
We're
Yeah,
back.
So we heard Kilmorna, which is Listowel.
Right. So at Kilmorna, we had the O'Mahony and the Vickers family. Now, the both those families are very important in Kerry, but just as a little aside, one of the Vickers family's members was Sir Arthur Vickers, who was appointed by the British government to be the custodian of the crown jewels, which were later stolen from Dublin Castle. And it was a huge and controversial event, as one can imagine, but he always denied any involvement in it, but it changed his life because the government sacked him, basically. So he was also shot by the IRA at Kilmorna House. So there was a tragic end to that story. Now, the next historian is Kate Cable. She writes about Crotta House in Kilflynn, which was owned by the Ponsonby family. And that was an amazing, amazing house with a lot of important architectural features. Then Donald Cameron writes about Ardfert Abbey and the Crosby family. Now, Donald is himself a member of the Crosby family. His mother was a Crosby. And so he has huge insight into the family and its papers and its history. Ardfert had a tumultuous end as well, a wonderful house in its time, but nothing remains today except the gates. Tom Denny is our next contributor. He is part of the Denny family of Tralee. They own Tralee Castle over many generations. And Denny Street, which is the main street of the town of Tralee, is named after the family. And that is a very detailed history of that family, and fascinating it is. Then I have, at this point, 3 chapters which coincidentally come one after another alphabetically. So first of all, there's Churchill House, which is outside Tralee, between Tralee and Barrow, Feenet, all that area. So in the period I'm writing about, it was also owned by the Denny family, another member of that family, who was a Church of Ireland rector there at one time, and his descendants lived there afterwards. Beautiful old house. This is now owned by an American family who married an Irish into an Irish family, really, and a Tralee family, or a local family to Kerry. And it's been completely restored, both house and gardens, and it's a wonderful place. It is private, so it's private to the family, who spend some time there every summer. So the next house I wrote about was Oak Park and Collisan's house, which is to the north of Tralee, just on the outskirts of Tralee. And here we had the Bateman and the Sands families. So the Batemans came first. They were given land in Queen Elizabeth's time, built 2 houses, and lived there for generations. Then the Sands family from Limerick bought the property. So it's since then, since that time, when the Sands family left, they sold to the Presentation Order. And for many years, it was a novitiate for young nuns in the order. And within the last 10 years, it has been sold again. Prior to that, actually, it was owned by the county council prior to its present owners, who now run it as an education leisure centre. Beautiful old Gothic style house, which is in quite good condition. And the next house I write about is Kilmurray House, which is in Castle Island, or outside Castle Island. And that was owned initially, built by the Mackintosh family. He also was a Church of Ireland rector, and it was built as a rectory. And his family lived there until the late 1800s. And then through marriage, the Mannies, the same Manny family who lived in Kilmorna House, a different branch, took it over and lived there. That is also now in private hands. Now, the next person writing is Dick Spring, who a lot of you will have heard of, because he was in politics in Ireland. He was Taoiseach, head of the Labour Party, Minister for Foreign Affairs, and did a lot of good work for Ireland and Kerry. And also during the peace process, he worked and did good work at that time. So he writes about his own family, the Springs. They came from Lebanon in the UK, and back again in the 1600s, his ancestor, Sir Thomas Spring, came to Castlemaine, where the river crossing there was very important at that time, and he was constable of Castlemaine Castle. So that's where the Spring family came into Kerry. Then we have Dr. John Knightley, who we heard of earlier when we were discussing the initial chapter, the burning of Kerry's big houses. So this time he's writing about Kilcolman Abbey in Milltown, which is close to his own home. John did his PhD thesis on the Godfrey family who owned Kilmorna, and so he is the most knowledgeable person, I'd say, apart from any Godfrey descendant, perhaps, about the Godfreys and Kilcolman. And there is another house close by to Kilcolman called Calnafercy House, which he's also very familiar with. The Leeson Martian family owned that, and John Knightley also subscribed or contributed a chapter about that family and about Calnafercy House, which is also now in private ownership and in very good order. And lastly, John writes about the Reeks in Killarney and the McGillicuddy family, who are one of the ancient Irish families. So the Reeks has a long and very interesting history, as do the McGillicuddy family. They were involved in the British Army in several cases. They were involved in farming for generations and were very innovative in that area, and were very good landlords, very highly respected. Then Donald Cameron, whom we mentioned earlier, lives in Beaufort House in Beaufort, which was originally owned by the de Mullins family, or the Mullinses, they were originally. Beaufort House, his home, which is privately owned, though he does run a hospitality business in the summers, I think. So again, a very interesting history, going back to in part of the story about the War of Independence and the Civil War, and what happened around the house, some tragedies that occurred, as happened so often at that time. Then our next contributor is Dr. Patricia O'Hare, who is the archivist in Muckross House. And she writes about Muckross House and the Herbert family who were owned extensive lands around Killarney, and also owned Carnan House, which is now a hotel, and many other multiple acres in the region. Carl O'Mahony is our next contributor. He's an architect by profession, Killarney native, and he writes about Flesk Castle in Killarney, which was owned by the Coltsman, Cronin McGillicuddy families during various eras in the history, and is now privately owned and has been restored. And Carl worked, he's a conservation architect, really, especially as a specialty, and he worked on the castle, and he wrote a wonderful article really on first of all the history, the detailed history, and then on the restoration works, which is very interesting. And then again, Patricia O'Hare contributed a wonderful article on Killarney House, which is no longer standing because it was burnt accidentally in the 1930s. That was owned by the Brown family, who were Catholic, unlike most of the other families. So that is a very interesting chapter, and also some wonderful illustrations, from the National Library, as do most of the chapters indeed, but some beautiful views of the lakes and the beauty of the house and the gardens, which were spectacular. And then my last chapter is on Derry Quinn Castle, which is down near Sneem, and that is no longer standing. Not a sign of it remains, except for the walls of what were the walled gardens. A magical place in its time, standing right on the waters of Kenmare Bay, and a kind of a fairy tale aspect to it. From the water, I've seen photographs, and there are photographs in the book. From the water, it looks, as I said, magical, and the mountains in the background, and the brown and the green hills surrounding. It was a wonderful place. It was originally built by the Bland family, who came in the 1600s, and later the Stokes family lived in one of the houses, Askeeve, which was close by. That house was burnt during the War of Independence. The owner at that time was a Colonel Warden, who was not popular and did not treat the tenants well. It's such a complex history, this period, because apart from the divisions between landowner and tenant, there was also other issues involved. There was issues about land and land ownership, and people needing farmland and for subsistence. And even going back to the famine, like all the various families had different histories regarding the famine. Like some were excellent. Some of the families bankrupted themselves by helping, or in their attempt to help their tenants. Some took the opposite view and did very little. But Colonel Warden was not a popular man, and all his property was burnt. And the walls remained up, I think, until around the 1940s, 50s, but it was demolished, I think, because it was dangerous at that point, and people were possibly wandering in and out in the ruins. So it was not, and it's now the site forms part of the wonderful Parkasilla Hotel car park for the golf club. So that's just as I said earlier, just the walls of the garden remain, of the walled garden remain. And lastly, we were fortunate to have 2 chapters contributed by Victoria McCarthy, who is Conservation Officer for County Kerry. And her first chapter is entitled Creators and Custodians of the Kerry Landscape, Now, this is as important a chapter as John Knightley's initial chapter about the burnings, because it sets the scene. It gives you an absolute view of the way things were. The people who came into the country in the 1600s built properties and had extensive land. As I said just earlier, a lot of them were good, a lot of them were not good. And the custodians of the Kerry landscape, like, they were a very important cohort of people and had a huge effect on our history. So that is a chapter worth reading as well, even, as I said earlier, for people who are not familiar at all with Ireland and its history. And the last chapter she wrote was on Belleville House, which is down in Portmagee, just beside Valentia Island. And she writes about the conservation story. The Butlers owned this house, beautiful old house, though it had gone into a very bad state of repair. And Kerry County Council became involved in its restoration and conservation. It's privately owned by a member of the Butler family, again. And but it's very interesting from the point of view of what can be done to bring houses back. Now, in general, the fate of the houses in the book, and obviously others in Kerry and around Ireland, their fates differ a lot. I mean, many of them were burnt, and the family disappeared, or no longer live in Kerry. Several of them in Kerry were unaffected because they were regarded as good landlords, and people didn't have such an animosity towards them. And perhaps going back to the famine, they had helped, and those things were never forgotten. Others, like Derryquin Castle, Colonel Warden, and indeed others like Ardfort Abbey, Ballyhigh Castle was another one. Actually, I have a feeling, looking at my contributors, that I omitted Brian McMahon. I'm just remembering that now. Brian McMahon, a historian from Ballyhigh, living in Dublin, he contributed a chapter on Ballyhigh Castle, which was one of the properties burnt, and it's just the front walls now remain. But going back to the houses and their fates, some of them are privately owned still and in very good condition. Others, less good condition, but are still in private hands, and some of them have been turned into hotels or guest houses or such businesses. So it's a fascinating subject. It's a subject I've always had an interest in. Back in 2018, I compiled a book called The Great Houses of Cork and Kerry. Now, that's no longer in print. I wrote it using recordings Morris had made with the owners of the big houses, called The Great Houses of Kerry and The Great Houses of Ireland. So these were the oral history collections. So I picked a certain number of houses in Cork and Kerry and the families, and compiled the book using those recordings. So my interest goes back a long way, but the Big House in Kerry is, I suppose, the work I'm most proud of.
Yeah. Well, and it's a beautiful book. Not only, visually beautiful, the pictures are gorgeous, and some of those pictures, had never been seen. I suppose it's difficult for maybe our American audience, like when you live near a place that is just burnt out, or the front walls are there and there is ivy, and you can tell kind of how beautiful it used to be. There was pictures in there that I had never seen, and very few exist sometimes, because if you were burnt out in 1921, it might have been photographed in the 1870s or the 1880s, but a lot of the time, it's, as you said, the family disappeared. So, Jane, would you mind teasing that out a little bit? Like, we grew up hearing awful stories about Sands, actually, a local kind of landlord. And what I thought was fascinating in your book, because of course, who else would they socialise with except each other? But, Trinity College owned hundreds of acres around Listowel. And all of these different landlords like intermarry. You can see some of the names like Lansdowne, very involved up in Dublin, of course, as well, and Shelburne, all these places. So it's, you know, it's interesting how they intermarry among themselves and kind of remain apart from the rest of the people in Kerry. You know, it's a
Yes.
class, obviously, thing, and religion and all of that. But, you know, there were some bad landlords, as you say, and then there was others who were great and went broke
Yes.
trying to help people. Yeah.
Yeah. It was, they were very much a class apart. Even they didn't socialize with wealthy business people. They obviously didn't socialize with less prosperous people. They did business among themselves. They also socialized among themselves. And sometimes we've come across family visitors' books.
Mm.
Like there was one from Kilmorna, actually, it was very interesting. Maurice might talk about that in a minute. That he discovered through a member of the extended Manny family. But in those visitors' books, you see lists and lists of people. You'd know the names almost because they were all of the same landed class. And they used to go and stay with one another for weeks on end, probably in the summer. I mean, they obviously had agents to run their properties, their farms, and their businesses. But they married each other. And as you say, they had extensive lands not only in one county but right across the country. And I was only thinking recently that before trains arrived in Ireland, they must have been onerous journeys, you know, by horse and trap and carriage, and but that's probably why they stayed extensively or for an extensive period in various houses, because getting there and back was
Yeah,
a
it was
huge
terrible.
journey.
Yeah.
But then with the coming of the trains, of course,
Yeah,
many
it
of
easier.
the local trains ran through the properties of the landlords as well. Obviously, that was a business arrangement when the trains were being set up, but that made it so much easier for them to travel. They'd have their own carriages and be totally exclusive to themselves.
And actually, that's an excellent point, Jane, about the train. Like the train system was more extensive back then than it is now. You know, like the train went all the way down to
Totally.
Carsiveen and places. Yeah,
Yes, that's right.
yeah,
Little offshoots, like from
yeah,
Tralee, there was a train to Feenit. And even in
gee,
later years, you know, just for the ordinary member of the public, you know, who wouldn't have had a car or access to transport, it was a means of getting to the sea in the summer, for leisure days out at weekends and things like that. And also, just generally, in the social context, when the trains arrived, it was the first opportunity for people in a locality to travel to another locality, maybe for dances or maybe for outings or whatever. And up to then, it was just the horse, the carriage, or whatever. But suddenly there was this ability to move miles and miles and miles. And it must have opened up society so much. I mean, people married outside of their own circle for the first time, probably. And family, new blood came into families, and you know, things changed. And you know, the whole aspect was wider for people. So the train was a huge change maker, certainly.
yeah, big time.
Definitely, yeah.
Go ahead, Marcia. Tell us
Yeah,
about.
I was just going to say how you know, we were both involved in this at the very beginning, where I had spoken to a lot of the families. I just saw how difficult it was, and so it was so hard to work on something like this, because Jane has a skill, I suppose, that can keep everybody in train. So all these other historians in Kerry had to be, you know, you had to explain to them that we're on a deadline, and all the times that you know, that you get the
herding
argument
cats.
to go back and had to be rewritten. But the whole concept and the idea all started because of COVID. And you see, we had both of us have a passion for Irish country houses, big houses, and we work as a team together. Jane's skills, as I say, are on editing, writing, and producing some amazing books, and she's just brilliant. And then, but my skill on the other side is to go out and to meet people and sit down with them and do a recording session. So I'm recording the oral history of a locality, a place, and with the big houses, the descendants of those that lived in the big houses. So it was a privilege, I suppose, over the last 29 years to have the opportunity to travel and to sit down with these people and to listen to the stories about the family history, the social history, associated with the bricks and mortar of the big houses, you know, because as you say yourself, every time you pass in the countryside and you look in at the landscape and you see this big burned down old house, and you think to yourself, I wonder who lived there, and you know what went on, what happened.
Yeah.
Because I suppose of the oral history and the traveling, I accumulated a lot of papers, family histories, family records, and then the oral, the spoken word, you know. So all that was very useful then in producing this book. And Jane's book is 360 pages.
Yeah,
so
it's a
very big volume.
Yeah.
But it's a book that is super value, because when you buy this book, you can bring it home and you can delve into it. Like you can read a whole story about one family, a whole chapter, put it down and come back to the next day and read another story about another family.
And the contextualizing ones are brilliant. You know, as you said, the garden kind of one, and the one at the start to talk about the running, that you have that overall.
So I should have mentioned the introduction.
Yeah.
Introduction, like written by John Knightley and myself. That also gives a brilliant insight, really.
Yeah, into
before you actually get into the houses.
Yeah.
You know? So, yeah, it was very, very carefully put together.
Yeah, no, it's beautiful. Maurice, just on that, like when you go meet the people that are left, and I presume a lot of them are kind of in genteel poverty, you know, now. Like
no, not necessarily. Yeah, well,
some of them, you know, But and like that's interesting in itself. The ones, how did some of them keep their money, you know, or is it constantly coming in again, you know, from England or wherever they are, or they marry an American and the money comes in? But, you know, how do they feel, the ones that are in genteel poverty and they're living in these big old piles? Like, are they resentful of the Irish around them, or the fact that we'll say their tenants, you know, betrayed them? How does that come out?
Well, the stories are quite interesting, because if you go back to the 1940s, 50s, when De Valera was in power at the time, 60s, you had a tendency to want to get rid of Anglo-Irish families from the big house. So there was a huge tax, or you know, on these people, on the houses. The idea, this is why a lot of the lead was taken off the roofs, so that they couldn't afford to keep the house. So what they did was leave the house and build a smaller house beside bigger house, and leave the bigger house just fall down.
Yeah, gee.
But and then the Land Commission came in and they carved up the land, and so you have you know, other farmers coming in and taking over. Now that's good where you had an absentee landlord and who had, you know, no interest, of course, divide up the land and give it to the local farmers. But the land bonds were for nothing, you know. They gave out about that. They gave out about the fact that they were marginalized and that they were targeted as a group who had because of their religion, because of their landlordism thing, that, you know, that everybody was painted them all with the same brush, and but they weren't. They were, as Jane said, they were quite good to their tenants at the time. But then, of course, the Land Act came in, and it you had all the tenants had the right to buy out their own land anyway. You know, so.
And I think it's important to sorry, it's important to remember that when the houses were built, they were built amidst multiple acres of huge estates, and when the tenants bought the land during the Land Act, the means of subsistence for the house gone. I mean, they had all you could describe as were smallish farms and gardens. That's all remained, and they were never going to provide an income for the house. So that saw the demise of a lot of them, really.
Well, and that's a great point, that it started before the war, but like 1870, I think, was the first Land Act. So it was a gradual kind of diminishing of their status before ever the burnings after the Civil War.
They became more and more isolated among themselves. They had their own groups. Again, going back to what we were discussing earlier. But you know, their huge scale of influence was dissipating all the time.
Another thing, speaking to them, one of my questions would always be, how do you feel about your Irishness? You know, are you Irish, are you English, or how do you feel? And he said, when I'm in the middle of the Atlantic, I'm looking one direction, I'm Irish, and the other direction I'm English.
The middle of the Irish Sea.
Yeah, middle of the Irish Sea. When I'm in England, I feel Irish, and when I'm in Ireland, I feel English.
So, they kind of don't belong in either place, really. Like,
they are. But I'm doing podcasts now every week, and a lot of the podcasts that I have in the library, that if you go into our Irish Life and Lore podcast, you can hear all these stories from the descendants of these Anglo-Irish families, of the and again, I don't like calling them
yes, they're different phrases.
they're different phrases.
Members of the, like, some people kind of say ascendancy, some people say Anglo-Irish, and sometimes it's used by others as a derogatory term.
Or the landed gentry, or would be
Isn't that funny? And like, most of us, of course, assume that they're all Protestant, but the Browns, I think you said, were Catholic, and
the Browns were Catholic.
O'Connell,
Daniel O'Connell, or the family,
and the Butlers go back. The McGillicuddies were Catholic.
Kerry at the moment, Sir Adrian Fitzgerald is Catholic.
Yes, Sir Adrian. We were very pleased to hear back in October that Sir Adrian would write the foreword for the book, which he did, and it's a lovely again introduction. Well,
and like, these titles go back. I mean, the Stacks came in the 1200s. They say they were granted land around Crotto, maybe as well. Now that might be our crowd, you know, like, who knows what one man gave you the name. But there is, like, we have French cousins, we'll call them, that have the scroll, like, from the 13th century of the knighthood. You know, they left Kerry though and went back, I don't know when. So my father organizes, remember during the 2013, I think, we did the gathering. So we had a big Stack clan gathering, and you know, again, like, my people might have never been in from France, like maybe we were just tenants on the estate that took the name, you know, but they were very proud of, like, the Crotto, and that the house doesn't exist anymore either. And but you know, it is that interaction, like, where, you know, as I say, we grew up hearing horrible stories about Sands in particular, and I think even his own obituary was not great, like, from his family. You know, he was kind of acknowledged as not being a good landlord and a good father. But very interesting, like the power dynamics, because of course all of these people, you know, some of them sat in Parliament or they locally, like in the town council. And it, you know, it is interesting during the Great Hunger. Like my own great grandfather owned a shop in Listowel, or great whatever he was. He was on the board of Guardian, like at the workhouse, and you know, a doctor. And but as you said, they weren't really socializing with the landlords either, even though they might have rubbed shoulders a bit.
Different class.
Yeah.
It's a very
Amazing.
interesting subject. It
Yeah.
really is. And I suppose the fact that Ireland's history is so complex, and they're
Yeah.
very much part of that complexity.
Yeah.
And their influence was
Yeah.
absolutely enormous
Yeah.
for generations.
For generations, yeah. And you forget, like Morris brought up the taxes under De Valera. Like I forgot, you know, I always thought, oh, the brain drain and the political, the ascendancy
Yeah.
class left in the 20s. No, like they were still being filtered
Yeah.
out, like, you know, in De Valera's Catholic Ireland, you know, kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
Very
Mhm.
much so.
Mhm.
Yeah.
There was tendency to it was cleansing, really, wasn't it?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
And you know, Ireland.
We're after the Civil War and the
Yeah.
Civil War.
But Ireland was very insular, really.
Very
compared
insular,
to
yeah,
those days as
yeah,
well. It was
yeah.
before the masses influence came in, and you know,
Yeah, modernized it a
the
bit.
migration and all
And
that.
Morris, you had another project about the Great War, which
Yeah.
is another tricky one in Ireland. Like my own great grandfather, definitely
Yeah,
was the great
that's-
grandfather this time. He fought, and like they were spat on when they came home in their uniforms.
Yeah,
You know,
I
it
was
was a
just
tricky
going,
one.
yeah, I was just going to
Mhm.
say
Yeah,
that
yeah, it's just that's the catalogue,
Oh.
printed catalogue
yeah,
of that oral history collection.
but
And there's some harrowing stories in that,
Yeah.
and it just
Oh,
shows
they
you
are,
as well the sacrifice
Yeah.
you
some
see,
of that class made
yeah,
in the war.
if I could say that another reason for the demise of the Irish Country House is because a lot of these families had a young son
Mhm.
who would have been next in line to take over the estate,
Mhm.
were sent out to the front line.
Mhm.
And because, you know, that they were maybe high ranking, most of them were captains or whatever, they were
Mhm.
first over the
top.
line, over
Yeah.
the top of the
Mhm.
trench.
Yeah.
And so chances are they didn't come
Didn't
back.
make it back. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
That changed
you know, there was
everything
a yes,
And
that
we know,
changed.
like the Kerry Fusiliers or whatever, they were decimated. Like, and remember they had to join in then with the Dublin, whatever they were. You know, like the Irish, all of the ones, the ranks were gone. You know.
Yeah,
That's
Yeah.
right.
it was quite
Yeah.
interesting actually. In Tralee we had Ballymullen Castle,
Yeah.
or sorry, Ballymullen Barracks, but that was where a lot of the Munster Fusiliers trained.
Gotcha.
So there was a public house just beside it, and it was called the Munster Bar, called after the Munsters, the Munster Fusiliers, and that was my grandparents' house.
Own that back. Oh, a house. Yeah.
My
Wow.
grandmother, sorry, my great grandparents owned that pub.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. My great grandfather, Joseph, ran off at 16 or 15, and his brother went with him, and the brother enlisted as Divan because you couldn't have two brothers apparently enlist, you know, both stack.
Yeah.
And their mother bailed them out the first time because they were, you know, 15 and 16, and they went back, you know, and kind of just for adventure, really. I don't know what they thought they were doing, you know. But she wouldn't bail them out the second time. She said, right, tough sugar now, you've to, you know, you've made your bed. And they were caught very quickly in France, and they were prisoners of war for the duration of the war.
Were they?
And and in a camp, like it was a lumber kind of a thing. And they made friends. It was a family living near, you know, at the other side of the chain link fence. And apparently my great grandfather was teaching the kids English, and they were teaching him French. And when they finally got released, he got married a couple of years later and brought his wife back there for their honeymoon. They went to that French family.
My goodness, yeah. Oh, that is something, yeah.
You know,
But
gee.
you know, you mentioned Prosser House.
Yeah.
Well, you had Lord Kitchener.
Yes.
He
Yeah.
grew up there.
Yeah.
You know that famous poster.
Yeah. Your country needs
we
you.
want you. Yeah, pointing.
Yeah.
We want you.
Yeah.
That's where he grew up.
Yeah. And then in Listowel and Gunsborough House, I think. But that is what's so fascinating too, like that as you say, the intermarrying, And sometimes like the agents of the landlord had a big house and they survived, even though sometimes the agents were worse, you know, than the landlord.
I
Like,
grew up actually, perhaps this is where my interest in the big house began. You know, I think as a child you kind of assume atmospheres or something, or visual effects or something.
yeah.
But, I grew up in Bandon
Oh.
in County Cork,
Mhm.
and we lived in the agent's house. He was the agent for Lord Devonshire, who owned extensive lands there and elsewhere. And it was a very minor Georgian house built in 1789. But it had all the Georgian features, and you know, the high ceilings and the big rooms and the light, you know, the light coming in. And I loved it.
Yeah, of course you did.
My mother was any spare time she had, she's 7 children. Any spare time she had, she used to go to auctions and bring home little bits and pieces.
Yeah, to try to restore
I
it.
think, as I said, you kind of absorb those things.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, yeah.
And I love for the, you know, the old antiquities, the old things in the house. Actually, Jane mentioned the autograph book, or the visitors book, and there was always a visitors book inside the front door of the big houses. And to my amazement, one day I was doing an interview with one of the O'Mahanys, who was a descendant of the O'Mahanys, and she was the custodian of all the family records. So we were going through our bits and pieces. Sorry, I just need to switch this up.
Oh, you don't.
My apologies.
No,
so
I didn't even hear it.
we were going through all the bits and pieces, and I discovered that the visitors book, as soon as I opened it, I saw William Butler Yeats' signature on the visitor. And this is Kilmorna House. And we in Kerry never knew, anyone never knew that
Yeats
William
had been
Butler
there, like.
So Jane spoke about the trains. Now the train would come down from Limerick, and on the way to the Stole would pass Kilmorna. And there was a station just outside the main gates of Kilmorna House.
Wow.
So he obviously got off there, and he used to spend a lot of time, because his name appears quite often in the visitors book. And so does Charles Stewart Parnell. Yeah, and his name is there. So here's a whole collection of very interesting people, like the elite, or the who's who of the day. They're all gathering together in the big house, you know.
I read, Jane, I think it was in Kilmorna House, you had a little anecdote in there. Was it Parnell didn't like a certain amount of people sitting at the table, or Yeats, and they said go away, and then he felt bad and come back in?
Yes, that's right.
That must have been Yeats. I couldn't see Parnell.
Particularly about people who've you know, gained fame in some area, particularly in the area of history, I suppose. But little personal anecdotes like that are
my mother bought the Diary of Dorothea Herbert, you know, 20 years ago when I was younger, and from Mucker's house. And there was you know, what's so funny too is like women's lives, and you know, they're not of course public, you know, but she had a little, almost a throwaway line in her diary about the riding party, and it had gone late, but that the cook and all of the servants like had been cooking for 7 hours, because of course sometimes it was a 12-course meal, you know, and there was kind of tatarara in the kitchen. How would they keep everything from spoiling? And I think they had to throw out the dinner and start again, like, you know, because these muppets were out, you know, riding their horses and had no clue of how we keep the, you know, we roasted a guinea fowl and now we can't keep it, you know. It was amazing.
7 hours, Elizabeth.
And it really was just a throwaway line. Like, her concern was the hunting party, but you know, you were kind of thinking, my God, the poor servants, you know, like, and who would get into trouble for wasting the food, or, you know, that kind of thing. It was amazing.
Well, that was another part of our project, was to go out and interview the staff that worked in the Great House, and to talk to you know, the maid or the gardener, the butler, the footman, the
And were they treated well themselves? You often hear that
oh yes,
servants had kind of more
yeah,
notions than the people who owned the house, like that. Oh, I work in the big house, you know.
oh yeah, no, but these
Oh,
people, yeah,
they had quite a status, you
Yeah,
know, depending on the size of the house, I suppose,
yeah,
and how much responsibility they had.
yeah. The housekeeper would be fairly posh,
Oh
like, you know.
yes,
Yeah,
oh yeah, yeah.
yeah.
That's actually when I was writing the chapters of the book, and also, you know, going through the other chapters, I was always very interested in the woman's role. I mean, in the big
yeah,
house itself, like the member of the family, but also,
mm,
you know, any anecdotes or little bits of information about staff.
Yeah.
And but I suppose the women of the families, some of them were quite influential. Some of them became involved with local community, mostly women.
Yeah, yeah.
Became involved in the Red Cross and
that's right.
midwifery,
Yeah.
things like
Yeah.
that, supported rather than became physically
Yeah.
involved.
Yeah.
But some of them then just stayed behind the walls basically and didn't emerge except for social occasions.
Yeah.
But there was another aspect, just an example I can give you. I spoke to members of the staff, which were in their late years now, that worked in Adair Manor.
Oh yeah.
And so it was really upstairs, downstairs.
Yeah.
You know, and but they, now looking back, they were still quite, they had huge respect for the Wyndham Quinn
Oh,
family.
Wyndham, yeah.
Yes.
I was going to say it was a Dunraven, but he was down the road. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
And he
right.
had been a good landlord, Dunraven. I was talking to the Knight of Glyn one time when they had opened the house as a, you know, hotel and restaurant and stuff before he died. And that was a very haunted house, Glyn, apparently. And he had seen a ghost himself when he was a child.
really.
And he told me, like I was saying to him, because I was living in America at the time and I had seen a documentary on it on the Travel Channel or something.
Yeah.
And you could honestly, you could kind of feel a bit of an atmosphere, you know, in the lobby. And he said, "Oh, don't you, like, we don't talk about that because it might act up." Like they had been locked in, you know, sometimes, and so he just said, like, "Stop talking." It was really
Is
funny,
that
you know.
the manor itself, Elizabeth? Is that a Dare
Yeah,
manor?
no, not Adair, Glyn Castle.
Oh, sorry, Glen.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, and he was the last, you know, and then he has a daughter, but the title couldn't pass on, you know, to the daughter.
That's
So,
right.
and she's still there now, but
She is indeed, yeah.
Yeah. But there is a spirit in these big houses,
oh,
really.
there must be, yeah.
I was just you were in your book, there is a lovely story about the Leslies of Tarbert.
Yeah.
And I was talking to Ursula Leslie only last week. And we were sitting down and chatting, and she said to me, I was sitting on my own here the week after Christmas. And she was beside the big open fire, and she was on her own, nobody in the house but herself. And she said the door opened and 3 people walked in. And she said there was a lady who was dressed in a very Victorian costume. And there were two men with the top hats, and they walked in.
Oh my God.
And they walked halfway across the room and they just vanished after that. And so I said, "But were you scared?" And she said, "I couldn't move. I was stuck to the chair."
Yeah.
And eventually she rang her daughter to come up.
Yeah.
And her daughter and her daughter's husband came up to the house, you know, knocked to the door to get in. But Leslie was stuck to the chair. She couldn't move. She was so scared.
Oh my
And
God. Yeah.
they had to break the window to get in. She said it was a dreadful situation.
Yeah,
be
Jeannie
in.
Mac. And she's a sensible woman, you know, like
Oh,
isn't
I
she
said,
involved with Writers'
she
Week
said,
and
I
stuff? Yeah.
wouldn't tell you this unless
Yeah.
it's
Oh, you believe
absolutely
every
true.
word she said, yeah.
Oh yeah, well you know, I was thinking about that. Not only have they seen generations of, you know, kind of family drama and then maybe the political stuff going on and the Great Hunger, but even just the emotions, like some of the servants must have missed home. you know, there must have been, like, we do a lot of work with Irish girls in America working as maids, and you know, like, you could be raped, you might have to share a bedroom with somebody you don't like. You know, there's a lot going on in a servant's life, you know, particularly if you
You
were
have no power. I mean,
no
your
power, you know, and working long
power is
hours, and
gone.
yeah. So just the emotion, like, of being missing home and trapped in an attic, you know, would be enough to cause a ghost, you know, I think.
And
But
everything
Mars,
depends on your superiors, like
and then sending money home, you know. Tell me,
Yeah.
Mars, about the podcast. Is it on your website? Is Irish Life and Lore?
You can access the podcast 3 ways. It's my name, Maurice O'Keefe podcast, or else you can have Irish Life and Lore podcast.
Okay.
And then the third one is Voices from the Archives podcast.
Okay, good.
They're also on Spotify and the usual.
Yeah, I'll link them when we put this up on YouTube with the, you know, the links. Yeah. And now to order the book.
Far and wide.
Yeah. Well, and I think people will love them, you know. And your book, then people can order that through the website as well. We don't have it in stock.
We publish and distribute it ourselves.
Okay.
It's in the shops in Ireland, but it can be ordered through our website.
Yeah. Well, I think this was fascinating. You know, it's as I say, the book is beautiful, and just those little social histories where, you know, families, the saga going on through the generations. I just was with Cherry Hill here, which is an old Dutch estate, and you know, they owned enslaved people, you know, back in the 1700s. But even after that, the descendants of the previously enslaved people continue to work for the families, you know, and so. Those houses have such an intertwined history between rich and poor, and Catholic and Protestant, and, you know, the haves and the have-nots. That it's as you said, it's a complex story to try to unravel, you know, and you know, I'm taking away from this, it's actually quite a lonely kind of, because you said, Mars, like, they don't feel English and they don't feel Irish, you know, so they're kind of trapped.
That's true. That's true.
I say a lot of the women felt quite lonely. Particularly, you know, first sons would often have needed to marry somebody with some wealth, you know, to into the estate and whatnot. And a lot of them married English and some American women. They must have had lonely lives. I've often thought.
Very isolating, like in behind the wall, because you couldn't be friends with the shopkeeper's wife or, you know, whatever it was.
Oh, you could not.
So, guys, thank you so much for this.
That was great.
I absolutely enjoyed it. And we'll probably get back to you. I know people are obsessed, my father included, with the World War I stuff. So we might try and do a talk, you know, about that. Kerry's Eye did a brilliant thing about, you probably saw it, it was a good few years ago now, where they traced all the Kerry people, rich and poor, that did, you know, so I have a copy that is fabulous. But thank you both very much. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thanks.
And
wonderful.
Not at all. And I forget what we were coming back with. And I'll put up your website. I know we're back on the 12th with a writer from the New York Times who's going to talk to us about the time in the 1920s when the IRA blew up Central Park. So that's our next talk.
So
thank you very much. And have a great day.
Really appreciate it.
Perfect. Not at all. Thank you. Bye-bye. Glad it worked out.
Wow.